Hello, everyone. Today we'll continue talking about the intellectual virtues. In the first one we'll talk about is intellectual fair-mindedness or intellectual open-mindedness. So it's a very important one. And I define it in this way: an ability or disposition to give opposing viewpoints a fair and honest hearing. When you hear someone that says something you disagree with, or that goes contrary to your tradition, or what you've been brought up to believe, it takes open-mindedness to not dismiss them immediately, to not immediately judge them as inferior or ignorant or an error or some such negative judgment. It takes open-mindedness to first hear them out. And of course, to hear them out does not mean that you judge them justifiable or reasonable or accurate or true. It's just the first initial step in the process of dialogue, being open to dialogue by listening to the interlocutor who disagrees with you. So it's a very important intellectual virtue. It's kind of the starting point of dialogue and therefore of growth and progress in the intellectual life. The slogan is think outside the box. So it's a mean between two vices, like most virtues. And here's one of the obvious vices: intellectual narrow-mindedness, an unwillingness or inability to see things from a different perspective. And if you start looking around, you'll see it everywhere. People who see things their way, see the life their way, have a perspective on reality. And when they encounter someone who disagrees, their immediate response is to judge them to be, unintelligent or crazy, or there's some way of that they do, some way of characterizing the opposing viewpoint as obviously mistaken, something like contrary to common sense or something like that. There's this inability that they display or that they willingly choose not to even try to understand things differently. They're so kind of committed to their ways that they're not going to look differently. That's, of course, a intellectual bias. If you're open to possibilities of you being mistaken and open to different world viewpoints, you're very likely going to get stuck wherever it is you've been brought up in. And unless you were brought up in the place that has no mistakes, and there's no such place, of course, you will not grow in truth. So intellectual narrow-mindedness is a serious obstacle to attain the truth. But there's another vice that sometimes it's portrayed as a virtue, and it's a vice. It's important to see it that way. And this is intellectual relativism. Is a disposition to treat all ideas or positions or perspectives as though they were equally true or on a par. And this sometimes gets confused with something that's very legitimate, very accurate. It's a wonderful thing that we have that we call the right to have your own beliefs or to express your own beliefs. But the right to have your beliefs or to express your beliefs is a political right. In other words, it's the kind of thing that binds other people's behaviors towards you. It is wrong for an employer to deny you, being an employee, opportunity to apply and so on, for the job and so on the basis of you disagreeing on religious matters or philosophical matters or political matters. You have the right to your own opinion. You can be an atheist, you can be a Catholic priest, you can be Buddhist. You can hold those sorts of beliefs, and you holding them does not entitle others to withhold political benefits like voting, holding political office, or owning property or having a job. And those are great things, right? Those are the political rights to have your own beliefs and to express your own beliefs. And it's a great thing that our contemporary society, a liberal democracy, enables people from very different backgrounds to live together peacefully and to have a good society. And it takes recognition of the difference, and it takes respecting the rights that other people have to hold their opinions to build that kind of society. And we should be very proud of having that kind of society. So it's crucial to say that. But notice that those are just political claims. Those are political points. Intellectual relativism is not about respecting people's property or a right to vote. It's about truth. It's about reason. It's about evidence. And it says that different perspectives, one that says God exists, one that says that it does not, are on a par. But they can be, right? Because either God exists or not. I mean, those are the only two options. So they cannot both be in the part. One is right, one is wrong. One is true, one is false. So it is a vice to treat different perspectives as though they're equally true, because they cannot be. Reality cannot be inconsistent. And here's a cool quote from the book to this effect. The moment that we come to believe that our ideas are equally true is the same moment when it no longer makes sense to question the validity of ideas. And the point behind validity of ideas just is the ability of those ideas to attain the truth, right? To correspond to reality. When you have a perspective, that perspective is accurate, is veridical, that it corresponds to the way the world is. When you treat all ideas as equally true, nothing is true. In the inquiry or pursuit of truth, that is philosophy, that is science, it all just goes out the window, right? You're done trying to attain the truth. And therefore you don't, and therefore that's a kind of vice. Intellectual relativism is a vice. So it's not a virtue. To be fair-minded or open-minded requires trying to understand other ideas or opinions. I mean, that's the giving them a fair hearing part. But the point of giving other perspectives a fair hearing is to broaden your horizons, is so that you can come to know more truth than the one you already know. So you can come to, for example, realize, if it is the case, that you're mistaken about something, is to come to understand your own preconceptions and go past them, is to disregard false beliefs and to increase true beliefs, right? The point of being open-minded is to increase the quantity of things you know, to attain more truth. And relativism gets in the way of that. So you can see how they're in tension. One is a vice and the other one's a virtue. So here are some examples and final observations about the virtue. At the heart of being open-minded or fair-minded is the conviction that truth is more important than allegiance to one's own tradition or group or antecedently held opinions about something. So if you were brought up in a culture in which you have this particular political view, say that people have rights to own guns, you must make a choice. You must make a choice to blindly adhere to the tradition and keep shouting, right? Keep defending your view and the political platform, or you can start thinking about it, right? You can open your mind about whether or not your views are correct. They could be correct, right? I'm not arguing they're not. I'm saying that when you confront someone who disagrees, someone who gives you reasons against your views, you have two options. One is to blindly, adhere to your tradition. That's the narrow-mindedness way. Or the open-mindedness way is to listen, to give them a fair hearing, to see whether or not, in fact, you are correct by listening to the evidence they bring forth, the reasons they bring forth against your view. It may very well turn out that you're open-minded and then you're right. You come to be vindicated that your original position was correct. But that's the open-minded, reasonable way of defending your views, not the narrow-minded way. And the former open-mindedness is a path for self-reflection, self-correction, in attaining truth. The narrow-minded one is not, right? You won't grow. When engaging in dialogue, the open-minded thinker listens carefully to the opposing view and considers it carefully, right? Before they start thinking about how to reply, how to respond. If you are already thinking about how to respond to an interlocutor before she even finishes her point, you are clearly lacking in open-mindedness. The game you're playing is not philosophy. You're being a sophist. You're just trying to defend your view, not trying to figure out who's right. And that's what sophists do, right? So be the philosopher, don't be the sophist. Be the open-minded one, not the narrow-minded one. Those are the virtues. The truly open-minded person will rejoice if her views are proven false in the process of dialogue, philosophical dialogue. For now, she can dispose of a false belief and get closer to the truth. Here's a good way of telling whether you're a philosopher or a sophist. When you're engaging in dialogue with a friend, a classmate, someone else, and it turns out they have by far the best argument, the best reasons. They seem like they're right. How do you respond to that recognition? Do you lament? Are you angry with yourself? Or do you think like, oh, wonderful, great, I learned something new, good, I can discharge the false belief and move on? If you have the latter attitude, you're open-minded. If you have the former, something is getting in the way of your open-mindedness. A good strategy for this class and in investigation in general is to practice open-mindedness, be fair-minded. Suspend your actual beliefs for a minute. When you're looking at new evidence, when you're looking at someone's telling their story, their perspective, their viewpoint, don't immediately start thinking about how to reply to it. Just let it sink in, hear them out, listen to the whole thing, understand the whole thing, spend some time thinking, how would the world look like through those glasses? How would reality look like if that were true? And just spend some time like letting the thoughts sink in so you can comprehend it from within. And then, of course, assess it. Is it correct? Is it not? How does it fit with your experience? How does it fit with other things you know, with other evidence you have? Open-mindedness is the first step in the good inquiry, philosophical inquiry, but it's a necessary step. Unless you take the step, you cannot escape sophistry or the temptation of being a sophist. So open-mindedness is a good virtue, an important virtue. Let's move on. The next one is curiosity. This one's relatively straightforward. A disposition to wonder, ponder, and ask why. Involves a thirst for understanding and the desire to explore. Slogan, ask questions. Maybe two vices, intellectual apathy, a lack of interest or motivation to know and understand. And if you start looking around for these things, you'll see people that they don't really care. They don't want to know. They have this attitude of just tell me what to believe and let's move on, right? They don't care about the truth. And of course, if you don't care about the truth, you will never attain the truth. You will just happen to believe whatever you happen to believe. And if it's right, well, be lucky. But chances are it won't be. So obviously, intellectual apathy is a vice. Intellectual over-inquisitiveness is a kind of curiosity gone kind of distorted, gone awry. Something went wrong. It's a tendency to want to know facts or details that are inappropriate or that otherwise intrude into other people's lives in a tedious or that are tedious or unnecessary. So it's a kind of curiosity, but aimed at the wrong things. You know, the person who enjoys gossip or the person who memorizes a lot of, unnecessary trivia. People who are kind of curious, but about the wrong things. That's over-inquisitiveness. So also not great for attaining truth. The intellectually curious has a natural desire to know and understand. And from this desire springs inquiry and investigation. In many ways, curiosity is the drive, is the motor that gets you through thinking and inquiry, and thereby developing the other virtues that make you a good thinker. So it's very important. Intellectual curiosity seems to be the most fundamental quality or disposition of the good learner or the good thinker. From it, other intellectual virtues blossom. So it's a drive that enables you to flourish and develop and form as a thinker. Observation and examples. The intellectually curious ask questions in order to come to know and understand, not as weapons in dialogue. If you start looking at how people interact with each other and what appears to be a dialogue and a truth, many times it's something very different. Many times people use questions not as legitimate expressions of inquiry into truth, but as mere rhetorical devices meant to attack an opponent, sometimes mock an opponent, or by insinuating that the opponent lacks intelligence. Sometimes the questions can be of the form, who's to say that blank? With the assumption that, well, no one can say that, so stop speaking, right? So there's this articulation of questions that are not really trying to figure out things, but rather they're used as ways of stopping the dialogue from going on, from continuing. They're rhetorical devices to block dialogue. That's not curiosity, it's something very different. An example, the student who thinks she has a fair grasp of the relevant concept just introduced in class, but she asks questions to confirm it nonetheless. So she doesn't naively trust her immediate kind of grasp of the concept. She wants to make sure she has a deep understanding of what's going on. And she's curious, right? She doesn't just want to assume that she knows when it seems to her that she knows. So that's a very good example of curiosity. The scientist who is puzzled by phenomena that fails to conform to the dominant theory. So if you know much about the history of science, that's how science progresses, right? There's this theory that is put forth because it makes sense of a lot of data, a lot of evidence. But then some things don't quite align up well. Some anomalous kind of observations are there. And the great scientists, are puzzled by that, are kind of bothered by that. And they start developing different theories to accommodate those. And, the process continues. And that's kind of how science gets off the ground. It takes curiosity. And that's a good example of that, scientist. Here's a cool quote by Albert Einstein. I have no special talents. I'm only passionately curious. And I'm sure he has special talents, right? He's brilliant. But the point remains, things didn't just naturally occur to him. He didn't just naturally said brilliant things. He was very curious. He was very tenacious. He put a lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of dedication, and he grew, intellectually. And now he is rightfully one of the great symbols of intelligence, one of the great symbols of genius. The thing that blossom, the flourishing individual that we see, intellectual individual that we see, is the result of the implementation of curiosity and tenacity, right? So he's a great example of intellectually virtuous character. Another relatively straightforward virtue is humility, an awareness of and willingness to own one's intellectual limitations, a recognition of the things you don't know or the limits of your intellectual capacities. Also manifested in a lack of concern with intellectual superiority or status or prestige that are typically associated with intellectual superiority. The slogan, admit what you do not know. And most of us fail to know a lot of things. There's too much stuff out there. We should be humble about that. So means between intellectual arrogance, also widely, well, unfortunately, very widespread, a tendency to assume that one's intellectual capacities are better or one's beliefs are more likely to be true simply because they are ours. And again, just pay attention when people talk to each other. Sometimes they disagree. And what tends to happen typically on both sides is that they both walk out of that discussion assuming that they were correct, simply because it was their position, simply because it's they who thought it, or they are the ones who are, responding to evidence. And they think, well, I'm the one who responds better. But it is intellectually arrogant to do so. What kind of evidence do you have that you've been responding better to the evidence, right? It is a defect to assume that you're better off than others, especially when the credentials are the same. Another vice is intellectual self-deprecation. And people, you see this as well, not as widespread, but this happens too. A tendency to undervalue or demean one's own intellectual capacities or accomplishments. A distorted sense of self in which you lower your own ability to know the truth, your own grasp of the material. And that also becomes an obstacle for truth because you're being unfaithful to yourself. And then the way that you go about studying and articulating your views tends to reveal or reflect the fact that you don't have as much confidence as you should when you do know. So this can be kind of humility, but gone wrong as well. The intellectually honest person knows what he knows and understands and knows the limits of his knowledge and understanding, right? So self-knowledge is humility. Authentic humility is simply an attempt to see ourselves as we really are, limitations and all. So it's a very it's a good goal. It's a humble goal. It's intellectually humble goal. Final observations. In many ways, intellectual humility is the simplest of the virtue. It's a simple command, know thyself. But it's also tricky to get to attain. Unfortunately, it is also one of the hardest to develop. Intellectual arrogance is a powerful trap. Most people tend to have an overinflated sense of self, their capacities, their talents, and the overall prospects for success. So the average student thinks of themselves as better than the average student. It's a weird statistic. The average professor thinks of himself or herself as better than the average professor. And likewise, it seems to be spread all throughout society. People tend to think of themselves as better than average, and the average person does that. So that cannot be right. But anyway, we should know ourselves. Humility is the art of knowing yourself, but we have powerful mechanisms, coping mechanisms, self-image mechanisms that make it hard for us to recognize our own limitations. But of course, if we don't, we fail and we lose track of truth. So humility is important. A great example of intellectual humility is, of course, Socrates, and we've discussed that already. Here's another interesting example, Abraham Lincoln. After giving Stanton a direct order, and Stanton not only refusing to carry it out, but publicly mocking Lincoln, calling him a fool, instead of acting out out of anger and spite, Lincoln, it is said to have replied, quote, "If Stanton said I was a fool, then I must be one, for he is nearly always right and generally says what he means." That's a very humble response, right? When someone who's mocking you is attacking you, but you know that they're very smart, you know that they're very insightful, you know that they barely ever make mistakes. It takes humility to overcome your natural anger response of defensiveness and say, he's right, he's likely right. And the story continues that Abraham Lincoln met with Stanton. They had a private meeting, and then Stanton described what it is that the policy or the order that Abraham Lincoln had made was foolish, was not optimal at the very least. Lincoln backpedaled. He said, "Oh, never mind what you said." So he not only publicly displayed the humility. He was open-minded to listen to Stanton's opinion and then reassess his own comprehension of the situation on the basis of the more well-informed person, the expert. So great intellectual virtuous agent, Abraham Lincoln. Last virtue is intellectual honesty. This one's also straightforward. A disposition to recognize the value of truth in itself and a unwillingness to distort truth for personal gain or benefit. Tell me the truth, all the truth and nothing but the truth is a cool slogan. Stemming between two vices, intellectual dishonesty. So a tendency or willingness to distort facts, take credit for other people's ideas or accomplishments for the sake of personal gain and benefit. And here's very obvious why this is a vice. A virtue is defined as the habit or quality or disposition that enables you to attain truth. Intellectual dishonesty ignores truth, undermines truth, it's deceptive, it lies for the sake of something that is not truth, a kind of benefit, political gain, money, something like that. The goal is other than truth. In fact, it's distorting truth, manipulating anything that is true for the sake of something else. So it's obviously a vice. On the other hand, another vice is intellectual over-transparency, a lack of discernment or sensitivity to when it is appropriate to reveal or present the truth or an opinion. You see some people that are very blunt and they tell you things that are hurtful, even though they're true. They say them in the wrong time, in the wrong tone, with the wrong way of doing it. And then they kind of defend themselves by saying that they're, truthful, they're honest. They're not, right? That's not honesty. They're doing something else. They're doing something distorted. They're using truth as a way of attacking others, and that's not a virtue. That's a vice. It's not honesty. Intellectual honesty is not so much about acquiring knowledge and understanding, but more about preserving and using existing knowledge and understanding in a good way, in a wise way, in an appropriate way. Intellectually honest people take care not to distort or mischaracterize information. They value truth for its own sake. That's part of what it is to be intellectually honest, to recognize the value of truth as such, not for the sake of making me money, not for the sake of my prestige, and not for the sake of how people look at me, but for its own sake. Truth matters. The intellectually honest person sees. So example of intellectual dishonesty is plagiarism. So don't do it. Don't do plagiarism. It's bad. And that is the act of passing other people's work or ideas as your own. You're distorting truth for the sake of getting a grade. Intellectual dishonesty. Stop it. A journalist that deliberately distorts a story to try to influence political events. That's not journalism, right? Good journalism aims at truth. A lot of contemporary journalism, unfortunately, aims at distorting, manipulating, or guiding political events by distorting the truth, by undermining or twisting or spinning things in the wrong way. Unfortunately, it's also pretty widespread. Also pretty widespread. A corporation that intentionally mischaracterizes the benefits of their products for the sake of making profit. And you see that a lot, marketing. Not all marketing, of course, but a lot of marketing. Sophists are the paradigmatic examples of intellectually dishonest people. They only care about persuading their interlocutor for some ulterior motive like money or power, regardless of the truth. Remember the definition of the sophist: someone who does not care about truth but a pure persuasion, someone who's selective in the recognition of evidence, someone who's not there to figure out whether you're right or wrong. They're not open-minded, but it's someone who's there to show how clever they are, how regardless of what they're arguing for, they can argue better, right? There's someone that's that they do what they do that looks like the philosopher, but they do it for the sake of something else, not truth. For the sake of distorting the arguments so they can get money or power or something else. So they're the paradigmatic examples of dishonesty. In fact, if you go back at the virtues, they're paradigmatic examples of most of the vices, a lot of the vices. And the philosopher, on the other hand, is the paradigmatic example of the intellectually honest person. It is the value of truth that drives his or her inquiry. So be the philosopher. As you're engaging in thinking, as you're inquiring, as you're doing papers, as you're going through classes, you're talking to your friends and relatives, as you're looking at political events, stop, reflect upon your habits, your thinking habits. Are you being a sophist? Are you being a philosopher? Now you have a lot of tools to try to understand what that means. The call is be the philosopher. Do it well. Okay, well, let's end here. Until next time.